Welcome everyone to Jane Austen and Company. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I am a doctoral candidate in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as well as the co-director and co-founder of Jane Austen and Company. I am happy to welcome you all to the fourth program in our 2021 series, Race and the Regency. Jane Austen and Company is a free public humanities series hosted by the Jane Austen Summer Program, or as we like to call it, JASP. This year, the Jane Austen Summer Program is focusing on Jane Austen's world, and we are going virtual with special lectures, Zoom discussion groups, and more. Early bird registration ends April 1st, and you can find out more on our website, janeaustensummer.org. But make sure to stick around after tonight's presentation because we're going to be talking more about how you can get involved with this year's JASP. But tonight we are so thrilled to welcome Professor Robert Morrison, who will be giving the talk, Making No Difference for Color or Character, Representations of Race in Bridgerton and the Regency. I'd like to hand things over now to my colleague and co-director, Dr. Inga Brody, to speak more about what the series means this year.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. So happy to see you again this evening. And I'm the co-founder and co-director of Jane Austen Summer Program, as well as the co-director of this wonderful series, Jane Austen and Company, Race and the Regency. We are sorry to say that our co-host Danielle Christmas, who's been such a valuable addition to our series, is not able to join us tonight because of a family emergency. So we're all going to miss her. But the speakers in this series are exploring the role of race, nationalism, imperialism, and identity in the works and times of Jane Austen, as well as in literary and film adaptations of the time period. Maybe you attended Danielle's talk on the Zong crisis in Mansfield Park, or E.B. Zoboy's discussion of her young adult novel, Pride. If so, you already understand the unusual mixture of talks here and our goals in general. Our goals are to gather this diverse cross-section of intellectual and professional points of view, and to grow together in conceiving what race means for understanding the Regency, and what Jane Austen's Regency means for our own complicated notions of race. Based on your presence and your enthusiastic curiosity so far, we're all thrilled by the prospects of what this series can achieve. So thank you for joining us and welcome back for this fourth event in Race and the Regency. I'm going to hand things over now to Emily Sfera, who's our technical director, who is tonight will be introducing our speaker.
Hi, everyone. Robert Morrison is the British Academy Global Professor at Bath Spa University and Queen's National Scholar at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. His most recent book is The Regency Years, during which Jane Austen writes, Napoleon fights, Byron makes love, and Britain becomes modern. The book was longlisted for the RBC Taylor Prize and shortlisted for the Historical Writers Association Crown Award for the Best in Nonfiction Historical Writing. Morrison's biography of Thomas de Quincy, the English opium eater, was shortlisted for the James Tate Black Prize. For Harvard University Press, Morrison edited Jane Austen's Persuasion, and for Oxford University Press, he edited de Quincy's selected writings. Now, before I hand things back to Anne, I want to take a moment to explain how tonight's event will work. In total, the event will be about 90 minutes. Once we're done here talking, introducing everything, Robert will give us his presentation, and that will last until around 6 p.m. At 6 p.m., we will open things up for Q&A. You will see that in addition to the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom window, there's also a Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box to put your questions for Robert. Put them right there. If you put them in the chat, they might get lost. Things are always a little lively in our chat. So Anne and Inger will be looking in the Q&A box for questions. Now, if you find the chat distracting, unfortunately, we cannot turn it off entirely for you, but you can close the chat window by using the red dot in the left-hand side. We are so looking forward to this talk, and I'm going to hand things back to Anne to kick us off.
Thank you, Emily. Please note that tonight's program will be recorded. We will notify you all via our Facebook page and website when it is available to view. And without further ado, I would like to allow Dr. Robert Morrison to begin his talk.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My first task is to get my PowerPoint presentation up on the screen, which I think I've just successfully done.
Yes.
I'm looking at Emily, who's nodding. Okay, so that's my first triumph of the evening. I really want to thank all of you so very much, and to the people who invited me, Inger and Emily and Anne. It's a huge honor for me to be involved in this program. I think it's so important that we talk about it, and that we can use great writers like Austen to help us think and rethink race and the Regency from a variety of different perspectives. So it's a real honor for me, and I hope wherever you are around the world that you are safe and well. And I hope I say something in the next hour that is of interest. So let me begin by saying there's what I am, a British Academy Global Professor at Bath University. And I have to mention that because that means that every day when I'm in Bath, which of course I'm not, because I'm marooned elsewhere, being in Bath means, of course, that I walk by the hotel where Wentworth writes his letter, and I walk through the square where Catherine Morland and Isabella go chasing the young officers, and I walk by Austen's house. And it is one of the reasons I chose Bath, was to have the opportunity to immerse myself as much as possible in Austen's world. And because Persuasion, my favorite Austen novel, is set in Bath, it was a pretty easy decision for me to decide where I wanted to go. Now, so if the world were otherwise, I would be in Bath, but I am not in Bath. I want this to move forward. Oh, I want my screen to advance, and it didn't. How is that possible? We planned this so well, and it doesn't move. Oh, that's what we want. Oh, that's what I want. That's what I want. Okay, so I have to tell you where I am, and that is I am in Kingston, Ontario. And as you can see from this map, I'm really sorry that America is effaced in the way that it is. I couldn't find a map that had Kingston on it that also had all the American states. But as you can see from this map, Kingston lies close to the border between Ontario and Quebec, and even closer to the border between Canada and America. And so I wanted to mention that because Kingston, in the history of the Regency, and especially the War of 1812, which of course took place during the Regency, is, I would say, that is the War of 1812 is probably the most important event for both Canada, or what became Canada, and the United States of America during the Regency. And so I wanted to draw your attention to where I am actually physically and how that relates to the Regency. Another reason I wanted to mention it is because when the War of 1812 began, people of African descent in Canada feared an American invasion. And so anxious to preserve their freedom and to show loyalty to Britain, many offered to join a militia company. Now, I say with some embarrassment, before I began to write my book, I did not realize the extent to which Black soldiers played a crucial role in the War of 1812 on behalf of the British Army and on behalf of the American Army. And one of the reasons that I got so wrapped up in writing this book is because when I began, I thought, oh, well, Robert, you actually know quite a bit about this period. And I didn't go very far before I thought, bloody hell, you need to learn an awful lot more. When I hear 1812, before I began, I think, well, that's the year between Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. But the importance to me and in the book of highlighting the ways in which people who have been left out of narratives of the Regency, I tried as best I could to bring those people into narratives of the Regency as often as possible. So this talk is called Making No Difference for Color or Character, and I will bring that up a little bit later on. What I want to do is move in 6 sections. The first, I'm going to define terms. Then I want to talk a little bit about representations of the way in which people discussed race in the Regency, the often horrifying way in which people discussed race. Then I want to talk about a series of men and women, Black men and women mainly, who lived, who survived in some instances who thrived in the Regency. And I want to end that discussion with the most important Black writer, I think, in the Regency, a man named Robert Wetterburn. And that will lead to reflections on Bridgerton, which I think many of us will have seen and I hope enjoyed. And that will bring us to the conclusion. In a book, I'm going to start now by just defining my terms, and you'll see why I'm doing this in a minute. In a book called The Regency Road, a man named Selway observes that antique dealers and film producers and stage directors in general define the Regency as from the early years of the 19th century until the accession of Queen Victoria, which of course happened in 1837. And so sometimes when we talk about the Regency, and this happens a lot on different websites, especially when Bridgerton came out, there's a Regency crisis, as some of you will know, in 1788. And so sometimes people define the Regency as the last decade of the 18th century and up till the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837. And so the Regency can be a pretty loose term for architecture, for furniture, for fashion, so on. That's how I want to. Selway adds, of course, that there is a much more politically and culturally specific Regency, but he says he leaves that to what he calls historical pedants. Now, this is me. I'm a historical pedant. I like crisp, clear definitions. And so Selway says, well, the only people that really worry about the exact dates are historical pedants. And I'm afraid that for the next hour, you got to listen to me, and I'm a historical pedant. And what that means is that I have a much in my book and in my thinking about Austen, in my thinking for this presentation, I have a more specific definition of what I'm thinking of when I say the Regency. So the Regency began 210 years ago this year. The British Regency began on 5 February 1811. Here's the historical pedant me speaking. When the Prince of Wales, as many of you will know, replaced his violently insane father George III as a sovereign de facto. And it ended on the 29th of January 1820, so 201 years ago it ended, when George III died and the Prince Regent became King George IV. My students always say to me, wait a minute, are you telling me the same person has the name Prince of Wales and Prince Regent and King George IV? That's all the same person? And I say, yes, that's how the British aristocratic system works. He was born George Gordon, he became Lord Byron. He was born Arthur Wellesley, he became the Duke of Wellington. So the reason I have put these two pictures of the regent up on the screen is because politics then as now, if you hate the regent, he looks like, as Austen did, he looks like he does on the left, which is glassy-eyed, pot-bellied, dressed ridiculously with a corkscrew hanging from his belt. And if you admire the monarchy, like the institution, the same figure from roughly the same time looks much more dignified. It depends on whether you have liberal-leaning sympathies or whether you are, in Austen's age, devoted to the monarchy, or some combination thereof. So one of the primary arguments in the book, as I try to construct it, is that this decade from 1811 until 1820 is, I think, one of the most extraordinary decades in all of British history. That's a very large claim to make, but I worked quite hard to at least get us to think about a time period as a way of, it's when Austen lived, and so and when Austen published, and so I wanted to think what that meant. This project started with Austen. I cannot take credit for my title, during which Jane Austen wrote. That's not me. That's a much cleverer person than I am. That's my editor in New York who thought up that title, but I have grown very fond of it. The Regency, I think, is not only the most extraordinary decade, or because it's the most extraordinary decade, perhaps, it definitively, I think, or most definitely marks the appearance of the modern world. And I will try to suggest the ways in which it does that. So it is a period of major events for certain, including the only assassination of a British prime minister. The only time a British prime minister has been killed was in 1812. It was the time of the Luddite riots. The person in the round circle on your screen is a Luddite who is looking to break the machinery that is taking away jobs from textile workers. The Battle of Waterloo, of course, on your right as you look, this is Napoleon after he's been defeated at Waterloo. The eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, and the Peterloo Massacre, when people outside in Manchester gathered for a peaceful rally, and the British soldiery shot and killed, well, estimates vary, but up to 18 people. It also had a glorious cast, including Charles Babbage, who invented what became, or first conceived, first imagined what eventually became the modern computer. Lord Byron, of course, the poet, Constable, the painter, Elizabeth Fry, I think the most important prison reformer, John Keats, Lady Caroline Lamb, Henry Raeburn, the portraitist, Sarah Siddon, I think the greatest tragic actress or actor in British stage history, Walter Scott, Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, Percy Shelley, J.M.W. Turner. All these people are active and making a real impression on their society during these 10 years. And of course, the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon in June 1815 on the fields of Waterloo. To the right, the picture is a woman named Priscilla. And I put her there because she is poor and isolated and lives a very, very different life than the Prince Regent or Lord Byron or any of the other people listed on the left-hand side. She is one of tens of thousands of people in London who lives a very effortless existence. And one of the reasons, or one of the things I really wanted to bring out in the book, is that there's this beauty and there's this elegance, a lot of which we associate with Austen, but there are also women like Priscilla who live in far, far more meager circumstances. And that is not something, for example, that Bridgerton paid a great deal of attention to. And I also love Priscilla's dog, which you can see in the bottom corner. So what got me interested in the Regency, what really got me going, is the day when I sat in this library and realized that all 6 of Austen's published novels appeared during the Regency: 1811, of course, Sense and Sensibility, and the 2, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion, published December 1817, with a date on the title of 1818. So Austen is really a product, at least her publishing career is really a product of Regency, her entry into the world as a published author all happens during the Regency. At the top is the image painted by Raeburn on the cover of my edition of Austen's Persuasion for Harvard. And in the bottom, of course, is the only known likeness that we feel pretty confident is Austen herself, drawn by Cassandra, of course, around 1811. So when I isolate the Regency and talk about it in the ways that I'm going to do, that means that people who came before the Regency or after the Regency are not part of, they're not part of the book, and they're not part of my narrative. And that is often a very painful thing, because I want to bring them in, but the publisher was very insistent that it could only have 100,000 words. And so it was a way of giving a focus and I hope a shape to my discussion. But there were, of course, major Black figures who published and lived and had a vital presence before the Regency, including Olaudah Equiano, whose book, Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, and Dido Bell was a protege of the First Lord Mansfield, and her mother was a Black African slave, but she died in 1804, and Equiano died in 1797. And so, as fascinating, as important as they are, they come before the Regency. And so I was given the pitch of the book. They were not included in my narrative. And on the other side, there were, of course, a host of major who wrote about their lives in the decade following the end of the Regency in 1820. And I think 2 of the most important of those people are Mary Seacole, born in Jamaica, and is of course known to us most for her work as a nurse in the Crimean War, and Frederick Douglass, who was born, interestingly, in the Regency, born very shortly after Austen's own death, abolitionist and orator, and his narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass and Bondage, My Bondage, My Freedom are, I think, two of the most important works of 19th century American literature. So I'm defining my terms so that we have a clear sense of where I'm aiming. And I have to say that when I wrote the book, I could not believe how much there was in these 9 years, 1811 to 1820, that went on. And I hope I'm able to capture some of the spirit and the courage and the dynamism of those 9 years. So I want to turn now to racism and the Regency. And I want to say a little bit about what it looked like 210 years ago. We're looking here at slave plantations. Britain abolished the slave trade just 4 years before the Regency began. That is, it abolished the slave trade in 1807, but it did not abolish slavery. So you could no longer buy and sell people, but you could still own them. And so across the Regency, and just sort of when I say a sentence like that, I put in my mind Bridgerton and the world that Bridgerton portrays. Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, but slavery was legal across the Regency, and it was not abolished until 1833. So we've still got another quarter of a century to go before Britain and the colonies of slavery is abolished. So it lasted. And of course, I always feel compelled to say that slavery in various modern forms persists now, this afternoon, today, all around the world. And so every time I write something like, well, Britain abolished the slave trade, I have to stop myself and say, well, they abolished the slave trade in one form, that it keeps coming back, to keep trying to get rid of it. So the person on the screen now is a man named William Cobbett. And William Cobbett is a passionate journalist throughout the Regency, before and after, but certainly during, a brilliant journalist and a passionate reformer. And Cobbett is somebody that I really, really struggle with, because he is one of the most eloquent spokespeople for people living in poverty. He is magnificent on the injustice of the aristocratic system, the greed of the monarchy, and the squalor of the lives that people are forced to lead, who are driven from the rural areas which he adored into the city. But Cobbett was also a jaw-breakingly, it's the only word I'm not even sure it is a word, but jaw-breakingly crude bigot. And so to give you an idea of the kind of thing that Cobbett said routinely across his career, and including in the Regency, Cobbett said things like this: the grossly ignorant Negro rises, even in mental capacity, generally speaking, not many degrees above that of numerous inferior animals. Cobbett was a very, very bright man. But when it came to race, he was capable routinely of saying and believing statements like that one. And so when we think about Bridgerton, or we think about the Black lives that we're going to discuss in a few minutes, that's the kind of horrible, horrible view that was espoused and taken as, unquestionable. That's what the situation was with the grossly ignorant Negro, as Cobbett says. Let me also bring up Matthew Lewis, who some of you may know as the author of a Gothic novel called The Monk. He's known as Matthew Monk Lewis. And Lewis is also a successful playwright. And in the Regency, he inherited highly lucrative slave plantations in Jamaica. And he goes out to the slave plantations to try to do good. And he's there on two separate occasions. And when he watches the interaction between the slave owners and the slaves, he comes to this conclusion: as far as mere observation admits of my judging, there does seem to be a very great difference between the brain of a black person and the brain of a white person. So Lewis keeps complaining that his slaves want to run away, and what's he doing wrong? And it never seems to dawn on him that they just don't like the fact that they've been taken from their homes and turned into slaves. He is, again, a highly imaginative writer and someone who, in some instances, seems committed to doing good. But the notion of slavery is so embedded in the British consciousness that he can't really process what's happening. It was not only Black people in the Regency who were vilified and abused. This is a man named James Mill. Many of you will probably know his son better. His son is John Stuart Mill, who wrote important works of feminist advocacy in the middle of the 19th century. James Mill had a very deep faith in what was called the civilizing mission of British colonialism. And this led him to fierce denunciations of the Indian people. Typically, he argued, the Hindus, like the Chinese, were dissembling, treacherous, mendacious, to a degree which surpassed even the usual measure of uncultivated society. Uncultivated is a word that always jumps out at me. Mill believed that Britain was there to civilize the world. And of course, he was not as attuned to the greed and the violence that accompanied that mission. It's very, very often the case that things were civilized before the colonialists arrived, and that after they arrived, that's when the barbarity was unleashed. This is a man named Thomas Quincy. I have spent a good deal of my life studying Thomas Quincy. This is the jacket of my Oxford University Press edition of De Quincy. And De Quincy is famous as an opium addict, and he has terrifying dreams. One of them is the Malay dream of 1818, so 1 year after Austen dies. And De Quincy in this dream says, I have often thought that if I were compelled to forego England and to live in China and among Chinese modes and manners of life and scenery, I should go mad. De Quincy's fear of these, now some of this is sort of wrapped up in his dependence on opium, and like many addicts, he craves what he loathes. But beyond that, there is this very visceral reaction to the East. So I feel compelled to say that it is a race in the Regency involves all races that aren't white. And so whether it's James Mill or Cobbett or De Quincy or Lewis, there are all kinds of narratives coming out of Regency Britain. And I think when we read Austen, when we watch a film like Bridgerton, we're getting a slice of that society. I think it's really important to remind ourselves that there are other things going on, and people who don't enjoy the privilege of Mr. Darcy or Sir Thomas Bertram, for example. So let me turn now to the lives of several Black people living in the Regency. Who were they? And faced with the abuse and ignorance and oppression that I have just very lightly sketched, what kind of lives did these people have? And of course, the answer to some extent is very, very different lives, depending on, good fortune and happenstance and circumstance and casual kindness and terrible luck, et cetera, et cetera. So let me begin with this man, John Thomas Smith. He's an artist known to William Blake, known to John Constable, and John Thomas Smith produced a book in 1817, the year of Austen's death, Vagabondiana, or Anecdotes of Mendicant Wanderers Through the Streets of London. He produced that in 1817. Many of the mendicants, the beggars, the wanderers that he draws are mutilated, have been mutilated by war or disease or accident or folly. Some of these people have lived in London all their lives. Some of them have been drawn to the capital from across the British Isles. Still others are immigrants or have been displaced or are freed slaves from America and from the West Indies. So I really like doing this. Because I don't think a lot of people have seen Vagabondiana, and because it comes out at the same time as Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, I find it a really exciting text. In the introduction to his text, Smith declares Black people seldom fail to excite compassion. And while I wish he had elaborated on that, that's all he says. But he paints or he etches a number of Black people living in London. And so I would like to introduce you to Joseph Johnson. And Johnson, as you can see, has a cane in one hand and a crutch in the other hand, and he is holding a hat, which he will hold out of course, to receive money. And he makes his money from this ship on his head. It is Nelson ship, Lord Nelson ship, who was, of course, killed at Trafalgar in 1805. And Johnson wore a model of the ship Nelson on his cap. And he would go to the drawing room windows of affluent families, and he would sit there and he would move his head in such a way as to give the ship the appearance of sea motion. And that's how he made his living. He made his living by entertaining and by drawing on his experience as a soldier, probably in the British Navy. This is a man named Charles Mcgee, who was a native of Jamaica and is drawn here by Smith in a London pub in October 1815. So he is, this is a few months after Wellington has defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, or Wellington and the Allies have defeated Napoleon. This man, Charles Mcgee, is 73 years old. Again, he's carrying a sweep. So we can, I always think out of the corner of our eye, we can see Dickens coming. Dickens is born in 1812. And he earns, Charles Mcgee earns his money by street sweeping. And again, you can see that he is holding out his pot in an effort to be paid for his labors. Pierce Egan's hugely popular picaresque novel, Life in London, features vivid portraits of both the upper classes and the working classes, lower classes in London. So this is a picture of which might be taken from a scene in Bridgerton. And you can notice, I think quite strikingly, given what we have been looking at, you can notice that there is not, that this is a room full of elite white people. Elites gathered on Wednesday night at a place called Almack's. A very casual acquaintance with Austen will bring you into contact with Almack's, which is a club in the West End for socializing and dancing and match making. Other clubs in the West End were more male centered and were for drinking and gambling, and often those exchanges often led to duels. So there is Almack's in the West End, which is what we see here. There is also, this is again from Pierce Egan, Almack's, which is a slang term for gin, Almack's in the East End. And this picture is, I think, a very intriguing one. The people with the top hats are the aristocratic elites who have gone slumming it for a night in London's East End. But there are other people here, including people who seem to come from different parts of the world. And part of the reason I put this slide up is because it is a reminder that in the face of the oppression and the bigotry, it was still possible sometimes for people without any money or who faced various obstacles to go out and have a good time. And there have been times in the last year, I'm sure you have felt like, I just want to think of something happy. And it makes me quite, it's important to get as balanced a picture as possible. And I put this slide here to remind us that not every day or every person of color, or every Black person, or every poor person, or every person who was disadvantaged in some way lived endless, lived in a series of isolation, despair all the time. This picture is a much happier picture of what a life in Regency was like. And Pierce Egan goes to some lengths to say the three gentlemen who are here enjoying slumming it in the East End had a far greater time at Almack's in the East End than the stuffiness and rigidity and formality of the West End. And of course, if we think of Jane Austen or Bridgerton, there are plenty of people who are very, very miserable in Jane Austen. So let me turn now to some Regency lives that are more legible and more easily seen. This is Thomas Molyneaux, who is American, born in 1785, so 10 years after Austen, same year as Thomas de Quincy, and one of the finest prize fighters of the Regency. He is a freed slave from Virginia, and he traveled to England in 1809, where he was managed by another American-born Black pugilist named Bill Richardson. And in 1810, Molino lost the fight to the English champion, Tom Cribb. Racism, this is the fight, racism unquestionably fueled support for Cribb. So you can see the vast crowd behind them. And according to Pierce Egan, who is the person who wrote Life in London, but he's also also absolutely riveted by the sport of prize fighting. According to Pierce Egan, Molyneux's color alone, those are Egan's italics. Molyneux's color alone prevented him from becoming the hero of that fight. So there is wide disagreement. Not everybody agrees with Egan's assessment, but Egan believed that Molyneux, that bigotry prevented Molyneux from becoming the world champion or the international champion in his fight with Cribb. Two other journalists, John Wilson and William Mcgee, took a very different view. And I put this quotation here because sport can be, of course, a tremendous unifier. Sport can be a way for us to think about changing the way society operates. And it's something that many, many people are passionately attached to. And this is Wilson and Mcgee watching the first fight between Molyneux and Cribb. And they say, when we first saw Molyneux knock down Cribb, that is when we first saw the black person from Virginia knock down the white person from Britain, all at once, all distinction of color was lost. We saw before us two human beings, and our hearts beat for the cause of liberty all over the world. So Cobbett can say things that keep me awake at night, but there are other commentators who recognize how, for example, a sporting match might change social or political opinions. And of course, over the past 200 years, we've seen that time and time again. In the rematch in September 1811 between Cribb and Molyneux, Cribb soundly defeated his opponent, and Molyneux died in Ireland in 1818. So, like many figures, including Austen, Molyneux rose to prominence in the Regency, but also passed away in the Regency. Another man that I am fascinated by is a man named Paul Cuffe, who was born in Massachusetts, the youngest of 10 children. His father was from West Africa. His mother was Native American. Cuffe distinguished himself as an abolitionist, a businessman, a political activist, and a religiously inspired philanthropist. He was devoted to Quakerism, and that belief shaped his public, that private faith shaped his public work. Cuffe was a whaling ship captain, and then he was a ship owner. And by the time the Regency started, he was almost certainly the wealthiest Black person in America, as well as the largest employer of freed African Americans. So his story is a fascinating one, especially when you consider the kinds of obstacles he would have faced. And his journals and his diary make for really compelling reading. Cuffe captained his first expedition to Africa in 1811, the year the Regency began. And you can see on your left Canada and America, and you can see the red dot where Sierra Leone is located. Sierra Leone was founded by British abolitionists in 1792. The town is Freetown on the coast, and it was a settlement for free Black slaves, including escaped slaves from the West Indies and American slaves who had crossed the border up into what is now Canada. And Cuffe became increasingly disillusioned with life in North America and decided that the only way of really liberating African Americans was to have them return to Africa and to settle in Sierra Leone. And so that was a decision he came to very reluctantly, but that's what he came to believe. The reason I mention him, or from my perspective, one of the most fascinating things about him is he spent the summer of 1811. So you've got to think of Austen getting ready for the publication of Sense and Sensibility. And Cuffe is in Regency Britain in 1811, meeting with politicians like Wilberforce and Clarkson, who are leading abolitionists, and religious leaders and businessmen and abolitionists to enlist support for the settlement of Freetown. And his ship, the Traveller, lands in Liverpool. Liverpool's wealth is, of course, built from the slave trade. And this event is covered in the Edinburgh Review. And as many of you will know, the Edinburgh Review is a very, very powerful left-leaning a periodical that was published from 1802, well, 1802 until 1929. In the Regency, the left-leaning Edinburgh Review and the right-leaning Quarterly it slugged it out over all the leading issues of the day. And one of the guiding spirits of the Edinburgh Review was a man named Henry Broome. And Henry Broome was a he was tirelessly working as an abolitionist. So when the Traveller first landed in Liverpool, that is Cuffe's ship, the Edinburgh Review wrote that it must have been a strange and animating spectacle to see this free and enlightened African entering as an independent trader with his crew into that port which had so lately been the nidus of the slave trade. So Liverpool was very closely associated with the slave trade all down the 18th century, and the Edinburgh Review, a major publication, covers Cuffe's entry into Liverpool in 1811, and I find that a really moving story that he was greeted with such enthusiasm in 1811 in a town that was associated with the slave trade. Cuffe's A Brief Account of the Settlement and Present Situation of the Colony of Sierra Leone was published in 1812. By this time, as I say, he'd become increasingly disillusioned with the racism directed toward African Americans, and he believed that there needed to be the creation of an independent African nation, which offered an alternative for free Black people from America and for the West Indies, from Canada, and from beyond. And that's the document you can see on the screen. That's the pamphlet. In 1815, Cuffe sailed again for Africa, this time with 38 African American colonists, and he planned to organize much larger groups. But his health gave way, and he died on 9 September 1817. So that's less than 2 months after Austen. I find when I think about Austen, it's very, very helpful to put beside her in my head the life of Cuffe and the life of Austen, and to watch the ways in which you end up rethinking Mansfield Park for sure, and the ways in which Regency society operated. So let me move now to a woman named Mary Prince, who was born in Bermuda in 1788. She was 10 years old when she was sold into slavery, and for the next several years, she passed from one sadistic master to the next sadistic master, enduring terrible, terrible levels of abuse, domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and so on. In 1815, a man, a sadist really, named John Wood, bought her and took her to Antigua. And you can see on your screen that Antigua is to the right of your screen. And it will, of course, remind you that in 1814 in Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas Bertram traveled to his slave labor property in Antigua for the better arrangement of his affairs, which toward the end of his stay are prosperously rapid. So it is a remarkable collision of Austen and Mary Prince, because Sir Thomas Bertram goes 1 year before, or maybe a few years before, Mary Prince is on Antigua. And her account of her Regency years on the island is, I find it really hard, absolutely essential reading, and horrifying what that woman was put through. Prince left a vivid and horrifying account of the suffering she endured in Antigua and then in London. She does a magnificent job, sadly, of describing what that was like, what it was like to be a slave. So, for example, there are many passages to choose from, but I chose this one. This is Mary Prince writing about her experience. Mrs. Wood told me if I did not mind what I was about, she would get my master to strip me and give me 50 lashes. You have been used to the whip, she said, and you shall have it here, that is here in London. I was also sent by Mrs. Wood to be put in the cage one night, and was next morning flogged by the magistrate's order at her desire. And all this for a quarrel I had about a pig with another slave woman. I was flogged on my naked back on this occasion. There are many, many instances in which Mary Prince is flogged for the most trivial, minor, capricious thing. And at the end of her life, she has the courage to sit down and write about it. The History of Mary Prince, which details her experience in the Regency and in the 1820s, was published in 1831. Prince wrote the first narrative by and about a Black woman to be published in Britain. 2 years after its controversial appearance, Britain abolished not just the slave trade in 1807, in 1833, Britain abolished slavery. It is not known what became of Mary Prince. After 1833, she disappears from the historical record. This is one of the quotations that always stays in my head from her book. The man that says that slaves be quite happy, that they don't really want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I never heard a slave say so. This is not a compassionate person writing about slavery or looking on slavery, a white person looking at other white people who own slaves. This is a Black woman saying, here's what slavery feels like from the inside. And anybody that says slaves are quite happy or that slavery isn't diabolically awful isn't either ignorant or a lying person. I've never heard a slave say that. That for me is a very important moment in the trajectory of 19th century Britain. So let me conclude this section by talking about Robert Wetterburn, who was an orator and activist and writer who was born in Jamaica in 1762, the same year as the Prince Regent, who was also born in 1762. Wedderburn was the illegitimate son of an African-born slave, Rosanna, and a Scottish sugar planter, James Wedderburn, who sold Rosanna when she was 5 months pregnant. And because Robert hadn't been born then, when he was born, Robert's new owners deemed him free from birth, which meant his fate was better than some, but hardly enviable. Wedderburn was raised by his grandmother, who was a woman who was nicknamed Talkie Amy, a Kingston slave, Kingston, Jamaica, of course, not Kingston, Ontario, who worked for her master as a market woman and who also traded as a smuggler. One of the most important and awful moments of Wedderburn's life was when he was a child and he witnessed his grandmother being flogged for witchcraft. His grandmother at the was 70 years old. The levels of barbarity defy belief. At 17, Wedderburn joined the British Navy and he traveled to England and he settled in London and he eked out a living as a tailor and a preacher and a propagandist, anti-slavery issues, and his eyewitness experience of the brutalities of the master-slave relationship, as you can imagine, dominated his political activism. And in the Regency, Wedderburn repeatedly linked the idea of slave revolution in Jamaica with working class revolution in Britain. And the image you see here, the illustration you see here, it's thought to be Wedderburn in the center of it. And if you look closely at this image, which is produced by George Cruikshank, who is perhaps better known for his association with Charles Dickens, but in this image, you have some of the most dreadful and ugly tropes of racial hatred and bigotry in the Regency. This is meant to be a civilized meeting, and Cruikshank displays it as out of control, violent, lascivious, etc., etc., etc. The threat of violence did not bother Wedderburn. He was confident that both West India slaves and British wage slaves, as he called them, were ready to act and would soon hail the kingdom of Christ and experience the new birth. That image of Wedderburn sort of dominating chaos is one that Cruikshank comes back to a number of times in his career. This is Wedderburn in the year of Austen's death. And I think very movingly, he says, "The earth was given to the children of men, making no difference for color or character." That's the title, that's the sentence from which I took my title. The earth was given to the children of men, making no difference for color or character. Wedderburn declared in 1817, the year of Austen's death. And I don't know if it strikes you the same way, but when I hear someone say the children of men making no difference for color or character, I hear Martin Luther King Jr., who nearly a century and a half later echoed Wedderburn's words when he declared, 1963, of course, "I have a dream that My 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, by the content of their character. The reference to children and the reference to color and character always bring, to my mind at least, Martin Luther King's passionate words a century and a half later, when the struggle was still going on. And here we sit today in 2021, and the struggle is still going on. So after serving 2 years in prison for blasphemy, Wetterburn published his autobiography, which he aptly called The Horrors of Slavery. He journeyed to America in the early 1830s, but he was back in Britain by 1834, and he died in Britain somewhere in 1835 or 1836. So you can see there's a pattern here. These people, we don't know what happened to them. They disappear from the historical record. Very, very unfortunately. So let me now, in my final few minutes, turn to Bridgerton and race and the Regency, and try to say a little bit about, I, of course, like many of you, I expect, sat down over the holidays and watched the program, and my reaction was, I think it's fair to say, quite mixed. And I'm going to try to outline what I thought was important and what I thought was inaccurate. So, on the one hand, I would describe Bridgerton as an escapist fantasy, which almost entirely erases Regency poverty, social injustice, and domestic and colonial violence. Not entirely, but very largely. There is virtually no mention of the slave trade or of the bigotry espoused by people and men like Cobbett and Lewis and Mill and De Quincy and many, many others. So I've been interviewed about Bridgerton quite often, and I try to make the point that the society that it represents is a very, very, very tiny proportion of the people who lived in Britain during the Regency, and it doesn't engage with crucial issues, I think, like poverty and colonialism. In very different fields, people like Molino and Paul Cuffe enjoyed some measure of success in the Regency, but the vast majority, like Johnson and Mcgee, lived in poverty. A slave by the age of 10, Mary Prince survived unspeakable abuse, isolation, grief, and domestic violence. Witnessed the horrifying attacks on his society, Robert Wedderburn advocated violent reform as a means of achieving a more just society. So in the face of that kind of onslaught, there are, I hope I've sketched in the lives that some Black people lived, at least as far as the record will allow us to determine. In Bridgerton, Will Mondage is a Black prizefighter who is perhaps modeled on Thomas Molyneaux. But as a whole, the series, the Bridgerton series, almost entirely hides from view the reality of most Black lives in the Regency. So no Black person in the Regency enjoyed anything like the levels of prosperity, influence, and freedom enjoyed by Queen Charlotte in the Regency, or the Bridgerton portrayal, or the Duke of Hastings and others. Now, many of you will perhaps recognize this portrait. It's the portrait from 1762 by the Scots person Alan Ramsay of Queen Charlotte. She is 17 years old in this image, and she's been married to George III for a year. And I was delighted to discover that this portrait is held in North Carolina. I did not know that before I was asked to give this talk. So that portrait can be seen at the Mint Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, that portrait has generated a lot of talk in the past 2 months about the possibility that Queen Charlotte was of African ancestry. And so let me just say a couple of words about that. There are several other portraits of Queen Charlotte, including the two you see here, where the visual evidence of the possibility of African ancestry does not seem anywhere near as strong. And I have thought about this quite often, and the words I've been drawn to are by, or at least one of the things I've been drawn to, one of the commentators is a man named Desmond Shaw Taylor, who worked for Queen Elizabeth II until COVID arrived, actually, and then he lost his job because nobody's visiting Buckingham Palace. Desmond Shaw Taylor points out that a more instructive source of images of Queen Charlotte might well be the many caricatures of her held in the British Museum. And Shaw Taylor points out none of these caricatures, and there are hundreds, and hundreds of caricatures of the British monarchy in the 18th century as today. None of them show her as African. And you'd expect they would, if she was visibly of African descent, you would expect they would have a field day if she was. And this calls to my mind Meghan Markle, who has been the subject of, who was the subject of 5,000 racist tweets in 2 months, not that long ago. And it seems to me that it is some measure, some guide that there were as many people in the 18th century who disliked the monarchy as there are now, and nobody attacks her. Nobody attacks Queen Charlotte. None of these caricatures show her being pilloried in that way. And so we don't know, but it is worth considering the ways in which caricatures might have seized upon it had it been a possibility. On the other hand, I believe that Bridgerton's inclusive approach to casting suggests new ways to challenge Eurocentric stories, vital new ways, and I believe it's crucially important. We have Elizabeth and Darcy in the bottom. That show is now 26 years old, 1995, and we have the Bridgerton couple at the top, the Duke of Hastings. I think that we need to think of new ways of casting and new ways of telling stories. This is a quotation from a colleague of mine here in Canada, and he's talking about a movement called Romanticism. And the Regency is sort of a decade within a broader movement, usually called Romanticism. When my mom asks me what I do, I tell her I teach British Romantic literature. And my friend Ian says Romanticism tends to be understood as a European and even a mainly Western European phenomenon. And so that has produced a vicious circle of sorts, such that Romanticism, or the literature, the culture of the Regency, in the array of especially literary formations and period constructions, tends to be less compelling to scholars of color than many other periods and modes are. And then Ian asks, as I want to ask, well, how do we break this vicious cycle? How do we move beyond this vicious cycle? And I think one of the answers is Bridgerton. I think one of the answers is shows like Bridgerton. Art can do a lot of things. One of the things that art can do is bring the past to life. And Britain, from one perspective, might be said to do that. Is it historically accurate? No, it's not historically. The historian in me getting very, very agitated. But does Bridgerton force us to ask questions like, what is the role of art today? What is the role of English literature today? How do we move the world forward? How does history and how does our interpretations of history aid or hinder that process? Bridgerton asks us to think hard about the stories that we tell ourselves and who has access, especially who has access to the resources and the materials associated with those stories. So I want to conclude by gesturing to one of the poets that I find most compelling in the Regency. His name is Percy Shelley. His wife, Mary Shelley, wrote Frankenstein. And Shelley says very famously in an essay of 1819, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. By legislators, he uses that word because poets, artists, creators of all kinds are the first to inscribe ways of thinking and modes of being that will eventually gain broad political acceptance, and unacknowledged because most audiences, I think, do not realize the role that Jane Austen or Bridgerton or Lord Byron play in imagining and then driving social transformation. Once Bridgerton puts it in front of us and we can imagine what that world might look like, it's a lot easier to think about how we might go about achieving it. So let me conclude by saying that Bridgerton, from my perspective, is part frothy romance, but it is also in part a call to action. It focuses not on historical accuracy, but on who we want to be now. And this is an image of a Black soldier fighting on behalf of the British in the War of 1812, which is where I began and where I will leave you. I hope that was of some interest, and I so appreciate your attendance and your willingness to let me talk about these things. Thank you so much. It's been a great privilege for me.
Thank you so much, Robert. We have gotten some great questions already in the Q&A box, but this is just a reminder that you can keep dropping questions in there, and we will be asking those questions to Robert. So to begin, we have a great question on when those racist views that you brought to our attention at the beginning of the talk were espoused and published. Were they challenged by anyone in the mainstream press via letters or responses in print?
That's an excellent question. There's a group of religiously inspired philanthropists like William Wilberforce and like Thomas Clarkson who want slavery to end. And so it is an issue that boils and boils and boils. It's when Wilberforce starts in the late 18th century, he has a terribly difficult time getting anybody to say anything about it. It's so accepted. It's just absolutely fine. And Wilberforce and many men and women along with him keep pushing it up the agenda until in 1807, the slave trade is abolished. And when what we would describe as horrendously racial comments come out, there is a whole group of people who wants to change that narrative and wants to say that these people are people. And I find it so depressing that we keep saying that and we keep getting George Floyd. It's time we move past that. So yes, those narratives are being challenged and people are saying we just can't round up people, put them on a boat and keep them in slavery. And that is challenged. It's just that, Rodney King got beat up in 1992. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. What are we waiting for? So, yes, they were challenged. We've still got work to do.
Thank you, Robert. This is also thought-provoking. You mentioned that Clarkson met Cuffe.
Yes,
is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And does Clarkson talk about that in his own writings? Because one question here is how much Jane Austen would have known of these events. And of course, she mentions in her letters how fond she is of reading Clarkson.
Yes. Well, Cuffe, the short answer, Ingrid, is I don't know. I certainly know that Austen admired Clarkson or read Clarkson for sure. Cuffe comes to Britain in 1811, but his success as a businessman, his success in, giving employment, direction, energy to a Black community is known before that, but not widely known. And whether he came to Clarkson's attention before he arrived in London, or whether Clarkson wrote about him after, I would like to think that Queen Charlotte is brimming over with African ancestry, but I don't know. And I'm not sure whether Clarkson mentions Cuffe or not, but that's an excellent question, something I should find out.
Thank you.
We've got a question from the audience on what's your take on why whites who well understood issues of class and poverty were at the same time uninterested in building coalition with people of color or enslaved people during this time? Was this a divide and conquer tactic by the upper class, or is there something else going
on? Well, one of the things you realize, like what I realized when I was writing the book, was that power is concentrated in very, 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 very few hands. And a lot of that power is concentrated, at least now, the merit has something to do with it, or at least it can have something to do with it. Then you just were born into it. What did Prince William do to become Prince William? Zippo. He was born into it, right? There are some people in the House of Lords today, they're there because their dad was there. And, the Democrat in me struggles with that just a wee bit, as much as I love Britain. So the people at the top were very interested then and now in keeping the power. I do think narratives which say Black people are, just a little bit above, ignorant animals, I think that was accepted unquestionably by an enormous segment of the population, which is why Mary Prince's narrative or Frederick Douglass's narrative or Robert Wetterburn's narrative is so important. It dispenses with the idea that we can dismiss these people as uncivilized, uncultivated, uneducated, etc., etc. So I think that the the belief in Black people as, you know, innately inferior, people who wanted slavery, who benefited from slavery, ran very, very deep. And, you know, we still haven't dislodged it. I mean, how deep did it run? Well, it's so deep that it's 220 years, we haven't dislodged it. That's very deep. And so I think that what you realize is there were lots and lots of white people in the Regency who suffered as well from poverty or discrimination or because they couldn't get a job. The power was concentrated in too few hands. That's the signal thing, I think, that we take away.
One of our viewers is following up, actually two of our viewers following up on your quotes from Cobbett, very disturbing quotes from Cobbett, and wondering whether, to what extent these were in print, and whether, to what extent he wrote about slavery, and also whether his bigotry extended to the Irish.
Well, I'm not sure if Cobbett's bigotry extended to the Irish. Cobbett had a great love for the working classes. Yes, it's in print. Yes, it's repeatedly in print. Cobbett's audience is vast. He publishes something called the the Twopenny Post. Is that right? Penny, something like that. Which accessible to people. The audience that Cobbett is astonishing. Repeats these things as a fact. You know, eat turnips. Black people are ignorant. It's an absolute given. And so yes, it's in print. And Cobbett is so strong on poverty. He's so strong on saying we can't expect Britain to thrive if people are starving in the streets. But they have to be white people for Cobbett. If they're Black people. So one of the interesting things that came out for me again when I was reading for my book, one of the interesting things that came out is Cobbett hated Wilberforce. He hated the abolitionists, and he never stopped bashing them. Why? Because the people, we get evidence of this in Dickens, the people who had money at their disposal, the people who could donate to charity, for example, kept donating it to people like Wilberforce. Well, that's no good. Wilberforce wants to give it to people in Africa. Wilberforce wants to help people in the West Indies. And there are people starving in Manchester and in Glasgow and in Leeds. And so Cobbett is absolutely dead set against it. So you realize that part of what's driving Cobbett's altruism is a really unpleasant form of nationalism. It's a very unpleasant form of, we have to make Britain strong, great, well-fed. We need to get our people out of poverty. We need to give people employment. And what's happening in India or China or the West Indies is just not our problem. And that kind of thinking, and it comes out every week. He comes out every week. Cobbett is bludgeoning this into the British populace. So yes, it's published, and yes, it's dismaying. And when you read him on poverty, you think he's great. And when you read him on race, you just go running out of the room. Like everybody, right? It's like a stark contradiction. But in Cobbett, the contradiction is extraordinary. He dehumanizes people. That's what he does. He dehumanizes them, and they don't matter. They don't matter. And Wilberforce tries to humanize them, and Cobbett hates him for it.
So this next question is about something that I believe was a plot point in Bridgerton, and someone is curious about whether or not this was true. Was there any suggestion in the press at the time that Molyneux was paid to throw his rematch?
No, I've not ever read that. The thing is that Cribb, in 1810, when he fought against Molyneux, he thought, well, this is a guy from America. He's a freed Black slave. I don't know anything about him. And Cribb was out of shape, not ready to fight, and thought he would walk in, throw 3 punches and Molyneux would be on the ground. And that is not what happened. And so as soon as the fight was over, Molino called for a rematch, and Cribb went, right, this guy knows how to fight. And so Cribb went on an extensive training mission and got himself in fight, if you pardon the expression, fighting fit shape. And so when Molino faced him again, Molino hadn't been quite as rigorous in his training, and Cribb had been very rigorous. And so I think the feeling is that Molino, it's disputed, but Molino was perhaps the person who should have been given the victory the first time. But to my knowledge, there's not much suggestion that Molino was a competitor for Cribb in the second fight. And Molino doesn't do spectacularly well after this fight, after 1811. He's dead by 1818. And part of it is that he is exposed for the first time in his life to freedom, to money, to a degree of sort of prosperity. And he, by most accounts, overindulges, like many other people in the Regency who just took too much too fast. And so I think my knowledge is that Cribb beat him. That result isn't contested.
Historical question. Since people of African descent have been in Britain since the Roman occupation,
yes,
there was a Black merchant class, is the question by Georgian times, but this seems to have been overshadowed by the influx of slaves. Is that a narrative that has been made invisible, or was this a less important group than we think?
Well, when I got a copy of Vagabondiana, which was a big, exciting, as you can see behind me, maybe you can see behind me, I like to buy books. And I really love to buy books from the Regency. And when I got a copy of Vagabondiana and went through and saw how many one-legged people there were from the Napoleonic Wars, how many Black people there were, how many women, impoverished women, how many old impoverished women, how many women that had a baby but didn't seem to have any partner, it brought vividly into view life on in the east side of London that is, Ingrid, I don't think it's hidden from view really as much as we think. I think that we just haven't taken the time to go and look. And, I say with embarrassment, I stood out the Regency and I thought, well, all read about Jane Austen and the Duke of Wellington and Lord Byron and Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley. That would be great. And then I started to work and I thought, well, you probably should say about the British Empire. That, just speaking, sitting in Ontario, what happened to the Indigenous people in this country is, not acceptable. And when I thought, well, I should probably talk about the War of 1812. And, that talking about, well, the War of 1812, shaped America and shaped Canada. But for the Indigenous people of this continent, it was cultural genocide, the disaster of that war. And as I started to do that, I thought, there are all kinds of narratives out there, like about the Black merchant class, that just have not been brought in. And so Austen got a much smaller section of my book, but I hope we learn more about her because of the world that she would have inhabited. She certainly would have come across a name like Cobbett. And so I think, Ingrid, that those narratives, like Vagabondiana has been in print since 1817. It's been in print for 204 years. And I came across it in 2000. And, you do sort of think, well, what have you been doing, Robert? What have you been doing? How come you haven't come across this? And I was fascinated by the ways in which there is a whole body of literature, like Elizabeth Fry is a really compelling woman who, walked into Newgate and said, nobody should have to live like this. And it's full of, people who are disadvantaged in all kinds of ways. And the women's side of the prison, of course, even worse than the men's side of the prison. And so I thought, I want to write a book in which Elizabeth, there's a wonderful letter when Austen says her brother takes her to the prison, and she goes through the prison and she stops and she doesn't say to us, here's what I thought about that experience. She says, I experienced the emotions. Well, yes, but Jane, could you not have found like 6 minutes to tell us more about that? So I think they're there, but they're not. Sorry.
You cut out there at a critical
Oh.
time. So tell us what Jane Austen said.
Oh, I'm sorry. Austen goes through a prison, and she comes back. She records it in her letter, and she says, I experienced all the emotions that you would expect. And then she goes, period, or full stop, and she doesn't tell us. And I thought, I always go, oh, Jane, what do you think I was expecting? Because I bet it isn't what you were going to go on to say. And these are the things that, when I wrote the book, I got so excited about Austen. You come back to Austen over and over and over again, whether it's about prisons or whether it's about the slave trade or whether it's about the monarchy or whether it's about publishing. She is, I was so pleased when Austen's name was first in the title of the book. She's far more central than I thought. That might be my own ignorance, but she's far more central than I thought.
Fascinating. Thank you.
So you talked a bit about Queen Charlotte and the debates about her ancestry. Right. And as some of these questions have pointed out, there are scholars who say that she does have Moorish ancestry.
Yes.
They're wondering, is it clearly established that she has that ancestry, or is that up for debate? It's
up for debate. I mean, the person I quoted, Desmond Shaw, said, look, she's dead. We don't know. But there are other narratives which say, well, look, the number of royal families in Europe and Africa is tiny, tiny, tiny. They've all got African blood. If you go back far enough, they're all a mixture, and that's a view. It's certainly not firmly established that she did or did not have Moorish blood. I mean, how would you tell for certain? And maybe this person, but we don't know for sure. It's been said. I've read lots of things that have said, well, Britain's already had a black queen. That's not the case. I would love to think Britain's had a black queen, but can we prove that definitively? And what percentage of Africa? It's a very, very vexed question, but it has not been established definitively. We cannot say, with certainty that she was absolutely of African descent. But I would say that by the 18th century, given the monarchical families in Europe and the intermarriage between them, that it's very, very likely that at some level there was African ancestry or Moorish ancestry. And I really admire Netflix for taking the very bold step of saying, look, we're just going to make it black. Right? Look, it's prompted this discussion. And that's what I want art to do. Ultimately, that's what I want art to do. I want art to bring us together and to let us think in different ways about the world we inhabit now.
Hear, hear.
That's what I want. That's why I get up in the morning. That's why I was excited about invited to give this talk.
Yeah, that's what I want too.
Yeah.
So one of our viewers invites you to, and I would love to hear this as well, but for you to speculate a little bit about Austen's intentions in creating Miss Lamb of Sanditon and what Miss Lamb. And what you think she would have done with Lamb had she lived. Had she lived, exactly. And, I suppose we could also compare with what Andrew Davies did.
Well, what Andrew Davies did, I think I'll leave that to one side, maybe. I think that Austen, my reading of Austen is that she is a far stronger, braver, more deeply enmeshed literary figure than we have given her credit for. And it's not that I don't watch that scene between Elizabeth and Darcy, and when Elizabeth tears a strip off him, it's not that I don't stand up and clap. I love that. I love that scene. And, I like the architecture and I like the greenery and the landscape. But to me, Austen is an author who takes on some of the central issues of her age. There's a very good book called Radical Austen, which came out a little while ago. And for me, that's the Austen I'm interested in. She is more closely aligned with people like Shelley and Mary Shelley than I think we give her credit for. And so, the plot of Sanditon, I would like to think that she would have done something, as she does in all her other books, that is courageous and innovative. and that would have pushed forward what it is that a romance novel. I mean, she is the novel of this whole genre that Julia Quinn and many thousands of others have partaken in. And I would like to think that Austen would have pushed it forward. And I believe that if you read the 6 novels we have, and things like the Watson as well, that Austen would have seized that opportunity to give us something a different, something new and innovative. And I think, for example, of Anne's speech in Persuasion, when she says, I'm not having that. The pen has been in his hand, the pen has been in a man's hand, and it's not fair. And her sense of injustice is very powerful. And I think that would have manifested itself in Sanditon. And perhaps in ways more interesting than what Andrew Davies gave. As much as I admire Andrew Davies, I'm more interested in social justice than maybe some of the things he's interested in.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Do you think that Austen's many references to slavery in Mansfield Park were intentional, or is it us trying to attribute her a specific view that we want her to have?
Well, this is what happens, right? When you become, a student puts up his or her hand and says, I'm going to criticize Jane Austen. Is that going to be okay? And I say, yes, it's fine, but be nice. What happens when we become invested in these figures? You're invested in, John Lennon, and so I could feel myself talking about John Lennon, going, well, hang on a minute, and then you go, well, maybe it's possible that she had, that slavery didn't distress her in the ways that now we would hope that it would. I actually think it did distress her in all the ways that were that we would find congruent with our own attitudes. But I think that her response in Mansfield Park, there's the pause. Everybody talks about that pause. I think that Austen was clearly against slavery, and I admire her for bringing it up in Mansfield Park. Liverpool was prosperous in the beginning of the 19th century because of slavery, and she doesn't disguise the fact that that's why Sir Thomas Bertram is prosperous. But it doesn't seem like, to me, that she endorses that. It seems to me like there's a critique of that running throughout the novel. I'm actually more distressed about what she says about slavery in Emma than what she does in Mansfield Park, but probably that's for another talk. I think she makes us think. Austen always makes us think.
Of course, it's not just a pause, it's a dead silence.
Oh, yeah. Right. Okay. Right. Yes. A dead silence. Yes. Yes. A lot of ink has been spilled on that dead silence. Indeed. A lot has been read into that dead silence.
Indeed. Yes. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. Thank you for reinforcing this ideal of education and the purpose of art. I think we need to hear that. We need to hear these defenses of the arts and humanities. And thanks for putting it to such good use.
It's been, honestly, it's been my privilege. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robert. And thank you to everyone in our audience who joined us tonight. Please stick around because we're about to share some really exciting new events in the series, including our creative writing workshops and how to get involved with this year's JASP. We would like also to take this moment to thank our sponsors for this program, including the Orange County Arts Commission and North Carolina Cares, Chapel Hill Public Library, and the Humanities for the Public Good Initiative at UNC Chapel Hill, who have provided us with partial support for this season series. But now we're going to hear a word from our partners at the Chapel Hill Public Library about our creative writing contest.
Hi, I'm Maya James. I'm a staff member at Chapel Hill Public Library. And on behalf of the town of Chapel Hill and the library, thanks so much, Robert, for your presentation. We're really pleased to be teaming up with Jane Austen Company on Raising the Regency, and we're especially excited to announce a special contest happening this spring as part of the series. The contest is titled A Truth Universally Re-Acknowledged, a Pride and Prejudice Writing Contest. The contest is to imagine Jane Austen's beloved story, Pride and Prejudice, in a new context, real or imagined, and submit your 500 to 1,000 word adaptation of the first scene or chapter for a chance to win admission to the Jane Austen Summer Program, which you'll hear more about in just a moment. Submissions are due May 10th. Our judges are going to be Martha Waters, author of To Have and to Hopes, Susan Brown, director of Chapel Hill Public Library, and Sonia Kamal, author of Unmarriageable. We'll also be hosting a couple of workshops to help you get started on your entry for the contest, although you do not have to attend a workshop to enter. The two workshops are identical, so you only have to register for one. Registration for the workshops and submissions are now open at chapelhillpubliclibrary.org/writing contest, which you also see there on the screen. The contest and workshops are open to anyone of any age. If you have any questions, you can call the library or send me an email at mjames@townofchapelhill.org. That email address is also on the webpage that you see displayed on the screen, chapelhillpubliclibrary.org/writing contest. Can't wait to see your submissions. Now back to you, Anne.
Thank you so much, Maya. We are happy to announce our next two programs for the Race and the Regency series. On April 9th, Professor Lyndon Dominique will be talking about the anonymous 1808 novel, Woman of Color, which is a unique literary account of a Black heiress's life immediately after the abolition of the British slave trade. Then, just a few days later, on April 13th, we're going to hear from Damien Scott with her talk, Bridgerton's Queen Charlotte is playing to the masses, and it's about time. So if this talk whetted your appetite to hear more about Queen Charlotte, be sure to join us on April 13th for a full discussion of her representation in Bridgerton. Full details and registration can be found on our website, janeaustenandco.org.
And if you want to learn more about Jane Austen's life and the world around her, please check out the Jane Austen Summer Program, or JASP. What is JASP? Some people in the past have called it Jane Austen Camp. 4 days of lectures, hands-on workshops, discussion groups, and other activities that blend scholarship with fandom. This year's theme is Jane Austen's World. And as Anne mentioned at the beginning, we are so excited that we're going virtual this year. So for those of you who might not be able to travel to Chapel Hill, please consider joining us this year. You'll be able to participate in all of our events. That includes a creative writing workshop, panels with a fantastic lineup of speakers, some of whom you see here on the slide, and even a murder mystery game. You can enjoy all of these from home, in your pajamas. I will probably be in my pajamas, and with a cup of tea in hand. JASP is now open for registration, and early bird registration ends next week. So please check out our website, which is janeaustensummer.org, and you can head to registration at janeaustensummer.org/shop.
And thank you to the nearly 300 people from 4 different continents who attended tonight's event. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please consider making a donation to the Jane Austen Summer Program. We're a registered nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible in the US. They help Jane Austen and Company keep events free and open to the public. They help us bring in great speakers like Robert and E.B. Zaboy. They also enable us to provide scholarships to middle and high school students, middle high school teachers to attend our programs and to learn how to incorporate earlier authors like Austen into the classrooms. You can help us work towards greater historical literacy and another generation of readers of Austen. Thank you all once again for attending. Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you for everyone who attended, and I hope you all remain healthy and safe until we meet again.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.